In 2023, ENHYPEN released Bite Me. It was one of the biggest songs of their career. Both engines and new listeners loved its dark, vampiric concept. Then a year later, Sunghoon sat down on camera and admitted the group didn't think the next title track, HYBE, lined up for them was impactful enough to be one at all. A lot of fans would inevitably agree with him. However, that song went on to perform exceptionally well internationally. So then, why in the world did a group release a title track they were doubting? And how did they go from Bite Me to that? To fully understand that, we have to go back to before either of those songs were even written. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about ENHYPEN just like this, consider subscribing. ENHYPEN debuted in November 2020, formed through a survival show called Island. At the very end of the show, 6 members were decided purely by global votes, and the final 7th member was selected by HYBE's producers. The group debuted very soon after Island concluded, with Belift Lab, a partially owned subsidiary of HYBE, handing them a fully established world and sound. Even though none of ENHYPEN were building out their group identity at this point, they were overjoyed with their situation. Belift Lab got what they wanted, a group that fit the style they wanted to market, and a group that performed exactly what they developed. But at the same time, ENHYPEN got exactly what they wanted. They dreamed of performing as an idol, and now they finally were. And it worked. The music connected with people. The members connected with people. The fans weren't just drawn to the songs, they were also being drawn to the 7 people performing them. 6 months earlier, they were practically strangers on a survival show to people. But now, they were performing together in front of people who had sought them out. For the members, this was the thing so many of them had moved countries for, and now they were finally doing it in front of people who actually cared. Belift 2 had exactly what they'd built the whole system to find. 7 people who hadn't just accepted the vampire world they were handed, but adapted to it and embraced it. The sound and concept worked because the people performing it actually believed in it. Everything was working, and for a while, that was enough for everyone. By April 2021, just 5 months after debut, ENHYPEN were already back with new music. Border Carnival was louder and more energetic than what had come before. The album hit number 1 in both South Korea and Japan. It even entered the Billboard 200 at number 18. And then they won for the first time on a music show, something Sunwoo had listed as his personal goal for the year. Both parties were getting exactly what they came for. Faster than most groups ever do, I might add. However, one of the members, Heesung, wanted something more. Months after debut, right around the time Border Carnival was thriving, Heesung set himself a goal. He wanted to start producing music, bought a laptop for it and everything. But at the next check-in, he laughed and admitted he'd used it for gaming instead. The schedule just never gave him the right window to work on it. So he went back to rehearsals, back to performing, back to doing what the partnership needed him to do, and he was genuinely great at it. But that ambition absolutely didn't go anywhere. It just waited on the side while ENHYPEN succeeded in this partnership. 4 years later, that same ambition would end up on an album that debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200, but in 2021, none of that existed yet. Over the next 2 years, they kept going deeper. Each release pushed further into the same dark world Belift had built, and ENHYPEN had made their own. They even launched a webtoon series to expand on the lore, and by May 2023, both parties had arrived at what felt like the fullest expression of everything they'd been building together. Dark Blood felt different from anything before it, much colder and all around more sharper. Bite Me became the song people pointed to when they talked about what ENHYPEN actually were. ENHYPEN even flew out to Poland to film the music video at a castle in the countryside. It was freezing. The members had to huddle together between takes just to stay warm. At one point during the night shoot, Jungwon looked up between takes. The Big Dipper was right there above him. He said he'd never seen it so clearly before. Nicky built a choreography section alone in his hotel room and had it adopted into the final performance. Nobody asked him to, he just did it. ENHYPEN and Belift Lab were fully aligned. The label wasn't making all of the decisions for them and expecting ENHYPEN to simply execute on them. Both of them were pulling toward exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Before they filmed the music video though, they had to record the song. The members came in one by one to record their parts for Bite Me. When most of them had finished, they went home. However, Hee-sung didn't. He stayed. Rather, he asked if he could help direct. He coached Jae through the rap section, told Sunghoon to split the beat differently, sat in that room shaping something that wasn't originally his to shape, because he cared about how it sounded. The engineer was surprised by how well it was going. Jae said afterward that Hee-sung had been a great help. Jae had always been that way too, studying choreography on his own time, learning languages between schedules, the kind of person who was always working on something whether anyone asked him to or not. The two of them understood each other in that specific way, and only after everyone else was done did Hee-sung finally go home. That laptop from 2021 was still sitting there. 3 months later, HYBE acquired Belift Lab entirely. Before this, Belift had been a joint venture, a partnership between HYBE and CJ E&M, two companies with a shared stake in what ENHYPEN became. That structure meant Belift had its own set of priorities, its own creative direction, its own vision for what the group was building. After August 10th, 2023, that changed. An ENHYPEN album would become the second best-selling album in the entire world. But right now, nobody knew what that acquisition was going to mean. Belift was now a wholly owned HYBE subsidiary, and HYBE's ambitions extended far beyond a vampire mythology built for a predominantly Korean fanbase. They were aiming for something global, aiming for artists who could cross markets and reach Western audiences. Okay, but why is HYBE so interested in the Western market anyway? In March 2023, just months before the acquisition, HYBE chairman Bang Si-hyuk said the company needed a sense of urgency to look outside of Korea. K-pop's presence on the Billboard Hot 100 had dropped by more than half in a single year. BTS was on a hiatus, and HYBE had just gone public, meaning they needed to keep growing. The US is the largest music market in the world, and HYBE was spending hundreds of millions acquiring Western labels and building Western artists from scratch. Every group under their umbrella was now part of that ambition, whether they signed up for it or not. And ENHYPEN, with their growing international fan base, were exactly the kind of group that could help get them there. And 3 months after the acquisition, they released Orange Blood. The title track, Sweet Venom, was noticeably lighter than Bite Me, and for the first time ever, they released an English version alongside it. On top of that, the digital album featured one version with Bella Poarch, an American artist who had built tens of millions of social media followers, largely outside of music. In a Billboard interview around the same time of release, Jungwon said Orange Blood reflected a desire to get closer to fans on a deeper level, and he meant it. But getting closer to existing fans and reaching new ones in a Western market aren't always the same thing, and the music was aiming to serve both of them at once. A week after the album dropped, ENHYPEN performed Sweet Venom on Good Morning America, one of the most watched morning programs in the United States, broadcast live from Times Square. Unsurprisingly, they performed the English version. 8 months after Orange Blood, Sunghoon sat down to film an endnote about their next album, and right there, in the middle of talking about the music, he said this.
이전과는 어쨌든 다른 모습을 보여줘야 되니까 새로운 모습 그래야 또 많은 분들이 봐주시고 엔진분들도 좋아해 주시고.
Those words have to, not we wanted to try something new. They had to, and the album reflected exactly that. Romance Untold's title track was EXO, written by Jake, an American pop songwriter who'd built his name through mainstream radio. Similarly to Sweet Venom, an English version featuring Jake dropped alongside it. However, what made this time different was the fact that it was actually a part of the physical album. 4 months before the album came out, HYBE had signed a 10-year exclusive deal with Universal Music Group, the largest music company in the world. Universal would now handle distribution and marketing for every HYBE artist in North America. 10 years of infrastructure, 10 years of resources, 10 years of obligation to justify the scale of what they'd built. HYBE didn't acquire Western labels and partner with the world's biggest music company to keep making dark vampire music for a Korean fanbase. They did it to grow. And growth, at that level, needs a formula. Calculated risks are everything. But what did ENHYPEN think of this?
저희는 되게 좋은데 이게 또 타이틀로는 조금 약하다라는 생각도 맨 처음에는 했어요. 근데
They felt doubtful. They weren't sure EXO was the right move for the ENHYPEN they knew. HYBE needed a safe song that could appeal to a wider audience. ENHYPEN needed a song that felt like them. And for the first time, those two things weren't the same. Brought the Heat Back was sitting right there on the same album. Powerful and exciting in a way EXO wasn't. The kind of song that makes you want to move, just like Drunk Dazed, just like Tame Dashed. Engines heard it and immediately said it should have been the title track. Not because it would have reached an international audience better, but because it sounded more true to the ENHYPEN they knew. Brought the Heat Back was electrifying. But EXO was the title track that suited HYBE's goal. Nicky noticed it too. In his own end notes around the same time, he said something that kind of stuck.
회사에서 준비해준, 회사에서 만들어준 곡, 만들어준 안무, 그거를 추는 것보다 뭔가 자기가 참여한 그 퍼포먼스를 자기가 직접 하는 게 되게 뭔가 힘도 나고 엔진분들도 되게 좋아하시고 그러니까.
He wasn't upset. He was just describing how they'd felt since 2021, since Heesung bought that laptop and never found the time. Even 3 years later, HYBE and ENHYPEN's partnership was delivering everything it promised. Albums selling millions of copies, world tours selling out, both parties getting what they came for. But there was still a version of ENHYPEN that kept getting pushed to the side, and because of their goals pulling in different directions, they gradually began drifting apart. Heesung had been working on music the whole time, not for any album in particular, just writing. The window he was waiting for wasn't appearing, so he had to force one open. On Romance Untold, one of those songs finally made it through. Highway 1009 was his own composition. All 7 members wrote the lyrics together for the first time. Park Ji-won, HYBE CEO at the time, heard the demo and raved about it, and then the album launched with EXO at the front. Highway 1009 landed as track 8 of 9, something the system had room for, just not at the center. Around the same time, Heesung said something in an endnote that reframed everything that had come before it. He said he hadn't made Highway 1009 with the goal of getting it on an album. He'd just been writing, the way he always did, trying to make something good he could share with fans someday. But then he said something else. He said he thought he'd been more afraid of making music than he'd ever realized. That the question, what if people don't like this, had been living inside him so long he barely even noticed it was there. That he'd been so caught up in that fear he hadn't even recognized that he enjoyed making music, that he was good at it. He said he felt sorry to fans that he could have shown them this side of himself sooner. It's likely this very fear that kept him from making music those years earlier. He wanted to write music from his laptop, but he was scared, and he didn't know where to start, didn't know what kind of song he even wanted to make. 4 months after Romance Untold, the label came back to the mainstream pop style. In K-pop, a repackage is common. Take an existing album, add a few new songs, release it again. Romance Untold Daydream did exactly that. The new title track was No Doubt. If EXO had been later than what ENHYPEN fans expected, No Doubt leaned even further in that direction. They chose to continue with the formula, doubling down on what they believed would work best. And it was working. Even though existing fans didn't care for the style as much, the lighter formula was bringing new people in. EXO inspired over 354,000 TikTok creations. Rolling Stone put it on their list of the 100 best songs of 2024. Not the 100 best K-pop songs, the 100 best songs. The album sold over 2 million copies in its first week. It debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200. It became the best-selling K-pop album of 2024 on the IFPI Global Album Sales Chart, the second best-selling album in the entire world that year, behind only Taylor Swift. HYBE had found something that traveled, and the further it traveled, the harder it became to argue that the direction was wrong. The song ENHYPEN weren't sure was impactful enough had hundreds of thousands of people making videos to it. A good chunk of them had probably never heard of ENHYPEN before. In May 2024, legendary Japanese rock band GLAY came to Jay with a request. 30 years of music, sold out stadiums, one of the most celebrated rock bands in Japanese history, and for their anniversary single, they wanted him, not just as a featured vocalist. GLAY's leader, Takaro, asked Jay to write the lyrics for his own part, in Japanese, a language he'd been learning in a genre he'd always gravitated toward. Jay said yes. It was the first time he'd ever written lyrics in Japanese, and Takaro later called it one of the greatest collaborations in the band's history. Then in January 2025, Heesung and Jake appeared on a Flo Rida single called Confessions. They said they'd grown up listening to Flo Rida's music, two people who became idols because they loved music, ending up on a track with someone whose songs had meant something to them before any of this existed. Neither of these were ENHYPEN songs. They were just members being recognized for who they were outside of a group context, and the things they'd been sitting on since 2021 were finding their way out even further. Then in June 2025, ENHYPEN came back. Desire Unleashed had two sides from the start. Before the album even dropped, they released Loose, a smooth English track aimed at the Western audience HYBE had spent the last 2 years building toward. It did well. Engines mostly liked it. The formula was still working, but the title track was Bad Desire, and Bad Desire sounded like ENHYPEN at full strength, the kind of song that made people remember what Drunk Days felt like the first time they heard it. This was the version of the group fans had been waiting for at the front of an album, and it did well. The album debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200. Bad Desire peaked at number 68 on the Global 200, higher than EXO had ever charted. Their English version of Bad Desire became their most streamed English variant, more than Sweet Venom, more than EXO, even though Bad Desire had significantly less time than those did. The audience HYBE had spent 2 years building toward responded harder to ENHYPEN at full intensity than to anything built specifically for them. The song that traveled furthest wasn't built for anyone in particular. It just sounded like ENHYPEN. Bad Desire gave the partnership kind of another life, where it takes on both of their goals. It returns to that ENHYPEN style, but it also has the English version that HYBE wants. And when those two things combine, it becomes something even stronger, as we can see. On that same album, Jay had a song. Helium was his first self-composed track on a group album. He wrote it, produced it, played most of the guitar himself, recorded it in a live band session, the way he actually wanted it to sound. And when it was done, all 7 members sang on it. Around the time of the album's release, Jay went on Weverse and talked about what Helium actually meant to him. He said the song was about being a balloon, and that Engine's love was the helium that lifted him higher. For years, he'd been studying music on his own time, learning choreography, performing songs that someone else wrote. And when he finally got to make something entirely his, he made it about the fans, about how their love was the thing lifting him higher. NME put it on their list of the 25 best K-pop songs of 2025. The same style ENHYPEN were so powerful with was now coming from inside the group. 6 months later, Jake had a song too. Sleep Tight was his first self-composed track on a group album. He said it sparked something in him he didn't know was there. That for a first attempt, it came together in a way that surprised even him. Heesung worked with him on it, co-writing the lyrics. The guy who bought a laptop in 2021 and never found the time, never found the courage, he wrote the lyrics. For the first song Jake had ever built from the ground up, Billboard called it a love letter to fans. Intimate in a way only a group completely comfortable with themselves could pull off. Since Border Day 1, when ENHYPEN happily performed what they were given, in Desire Unleash, where they're now performing both what the company needs and what they actually want, so much has changed. The music that traveled furthest was the music that felt most like them. The creative ambition that had been sitting on the side since 2021 finally came out right. In the partnership that had drifted gently apart over the 2 years, found something to agree on again. Neither party ended up back where they started, but maybe that was never the point. If you want to see how ENHYPEN have continued to live within the conditions of their survival show, even after debuting, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching. Bye 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 bye.